Hi, welcome to the Cloud Computing Therapy session. If you guys are here for AA, that's actually down the hall. If you're here in confusion thinking that we're going to be doling out some kind of drugs or something, that's not this. Wait, can you hear me? Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. All right, so now that you can actually hear me, let's start the session. I'm Cara. I am also, for those of you who are lucky enough to work with me on a day-to-day basis, known as a salt vampire. I tend to get a little salty when I talk about security topics. I'm very passionate. I am the offensive lead at Datadog. Prior to that, I worked as a security consultant, breaking shit for NCC Group. And I'm going to let the co-host introduce himself.
Well, skip over there. Thank you. All right, so I'm Integral, Andy Cooper. I actually no longer work at the place that she does, which actually presented a lot of a problem here with this talk, and I wanted to, at some point, hand it over to her and have her take over everything, because she'd been doing all the work for most of this, and I didn't feel right to actually come up here and talk. And she stopped and she said, no, that's unacceptable. You're going to come and get on stage and be eye candy, if nothing else. So hopefully I've done a decent job of that until my parts come up again.
Yeah, he does look good in a suit, so got something to look at. All right, so therapy session. We are talking about cloud computing. Therapy session is heavy on the quotes because this is more of a rant session. I'm venting some of my frustrations in dealing with cloud platform security and all the different gaps and issues that come up as a result of the choices that they've made and the options that they give you to configure. So hopefully you guys are going to walk out of here better armed with how to gain better insight, where the shortcomings are with various cloud platforms, and a few tools that are going to be open sourced in the next coming weeks that can help you with that. So I know that with cloud computing, life before cloud computing, cloud platforms was hellish. So buying out and spinning up your own infrastructure is just, I'm sure it was a complete nightmare, and all the things that I'm going to be complaining about and bitching about on this are nothing compared to what it was before. But now that we are living in the world of the cloud, we're actually paying other people to deal with that. So it's still legit because we can do better. We can be better. Cloud computing doesn't have to be as hard as it is. So the clouds, when I talk about cloud computing, the ones that we're going to be focusing on today are really, honestly, the only ones that matter. So we've got AWS, Azure, and GCP. And just to back that up, I've got stats. As you can see, those three truly do have the biggest market share. I know it's just over 50%, but still. The others, none of them, the percentage-wise, goes above what GCP has. And I know 6% doesn't sound like much, but when you look at the actual numbers, it's quite a bit. All right, so first up, Azure. Gaining visibility in Azure is, let's just say it's a bit of an adventure. It can be very difficult, frustrating, and I've lost hours trying to gain programmatic visibility. And so what I mean by that specifically is in this first screenshot, it's a close-up, obviously, of VM listing in one of the subscriptions that we have at Datadog. As you can see, there's 45 VMs, 45 instances in this specific subscription. But when I look at it on the CLI and try to do the same thing, I'm only getting, I'm actually missing about 10 VMs. And it took me quite a bit to figure out what the hell was going on, why I wasn't seeing all the VMs. And I'm going to blame Azure because this is my rant session, but it could also be because I just suck at computering. So this is how I felt.
So to be fair to Cara here for a bit, she actually spent a decent amount of time doing this exact thing here, staring at this picture, not realizing the rest of the world is there, and pen tested that environment, not for too long, because it's an understandable thing where all of a sudden your IP addresses aren't coming back and you can't automate everything and make sure that it's happening all the time. You're just gonna miss a lot.
Yeah, so when I realized that the testing that I had done was not complete, I was pissed. So I'm going to take it back and we'll talk about the reasons behind this. With Azure, there's actually two separate deployment models. The initial, the original, is the Azure Service Management Deployment Model, also known as ASM, Classic, Legacy. And then the brand spanking new one, the one that everybody should be using, is the Azure Resource Management Model, also known as ARM, not to be confused with other acronyms that take that. So the main difference between ASM and ARM is the fact that Classic doesn't have as many options when it comes to security. You can't get fine-grained security controls on resources in Classic. You also can't group resources. All the resources are at the cloud service level. You don't have it's just, I don't know. The web portal is completely deprecated. It's extremely difficult to interact with these resources programmatically for reasons that we're going to get into. You don't have the option to configure DNS. Security group management is kind of a headache. And with ARM, all of this is fixed. Azure realized that, ASM wasn't that great. So Classic wasn't that great. So they're going to improve it. So they introduced role-based access controls, and they introduced grouping of resources and all the other security configurations that make managing your infrastructure in the cloud so much more, just so much easier. Lesson here is you should not be on Classic, but at Datadog, unfortunately, we have to deal with both. So with the Classic, now that they've got the two different deployment models, that means that you also have two completely separate authentication schemes for the API. And in addition to this, the CLI tool that they support for programmatic access interacting with the resources through the API doesn't support the Classic API. That's cool. And then if you want to be able to, after you've Googled and written out tons of scripts to interact with the Classic APIs on your own, if you want to be able to interact with it, you actually have to have admin rights to the account. You have to have admin rights in the subscription. That just throws a principle of least privilege out the window because you're pretty much giving the keys to the castle to someone who probably only needs read-only access, but now you're placing all of your ARM resources at risk in addition to the Classic resources because you are using two different deployment models. It saddens me as a security person that this is the state that it's in. So I might suck at reading documentation, so part of this might be me, but again, I'm blaming Azure. Their documentation is shit. When you're looking at the CLI tool, sorry, I'm not a delicate flower, so I apologize if I'm offending people by my language. When you look at the CLI tool, the release notes, it's already on version 2.0, so obviously there's a version 1, but there's no information about that. And in the release notes, it doesn't state that the CLI tool doesn't support Classic APIs. So I'm using it the way that you're supposed to. Why the hell am I not seeing everything? You got to go into CLI versioning to find out that there is actually a difference between the two, version 1 and 2.0. 2.0 has nothing to do with Classic. If you want to interact with it programmatically, you have to use 1.0. But there's no link, no nothing, so you still have to Google and find it or script it up yourself. They do have the tool that is not completely supported anymore. It's just in the state that it's going to be, that you can get for the Azure CLI 1.0, but again, you have to search it on your own. It's not referenced really anywhere in the documentation on the site. The more infuriating part is with the APIs. There are quite a few areas within the API for the REST API that if you are sending the authentication that is for ARM, it'll give you back the information that's in the ARM deployment model. But then you can just send your authentication to the same exact API, but for ASM, and then it'll give you the rest. There's no way to get everything just with one call. So the lesson here is don't do Classic. If you can at all, just get rid of it. Do not, stay away. It's worse than drugs.
One of the big benefits there is if everybody else stops using Classic, then she can stop using Classic, and then I have to stop hearing about people using Classic, and I'd really appreciate that.
Because Datadog, we do have clients that are on Classic, so we have to support it. So this isn't an option for me. So I would love it if everyone else would just move off it, and then we can just forget about this part. You can migrate from Classic. This is actually really well documented. But if you're in a state like me where you have to deal with both, you might as well just take a shot of whiskey, strap in, and deal with it. There are ways around it. You can build out applications to do what you want and then really secure the access to it to ensure that malicious actions aren't being taken with your owner keys. But again, that's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through to reduce the attack surface with your specific subscription if you are dealing with both deployment models. So that's the story of Azure. Next up, let's talk GCP. So GCP doesn't have the issues with visibility that Azure does. GCP only has one deployment model, so that's awesome. And you can interact with it programmatically with no problem. My issues with GCP is the fact that it's a little too open for my taste. It's open by default. both publicly as well as internally within the project. And so what I mean by this is when you are spinning up instances and you're trying to configure it so it's only for internal access within your project, if you're using the UI and you're not using like Terraform or some other management tool to interact with it, these settings are buried. And sometimes it's really not obvious how you are going to be able to disable the IP, the public IP rather. And so up here, I've just got an example of all the different menus that you actually have to click through to get to that point where you can tell it, don't assign it an IP. Yes, I know this is, I'm bitching, nitpicking, but it annoys the fuck out of me. In addition to that, unless you've gone through to configure your VPCs correctly and your firewall rules correctly, when you do spin up an instance, the default settings is that it's open to the project internally for all the instances. So it really does, the default settings encourage flat networks. Granted, obviously, you know, you should be doing your due diligence and configuring firewall rules correctly and all that, but let's face it, devs can be lazy and they just want to get things spun up, so it makes it a bit of a headache. And I'm also pointing this out because in comparison to some other cloud platforms, AWS, you can sit there and configure the firewall rules before the instance, like through the UI, before the instance has actually been spun up, instead of having to go to a completely different interface to fix that. So as I said, GCP is all about open connectivity, both publicly and internally, unless you're dealing with traffic on port 25. So by default, like they do not allow any type of traffic on port 25. And the reason for this is they say that there's, and they're right, there's a lot of abuse when it comes to SMTP server to server. And so in order to put a stop to this, they just decided to not allow traffic on port 25. But that doesn't mean you can't use a custom port. Also doesn't mean you can't use 465 or 587. You just can't use port 25 because security. This is not a real security fix, and it annoys it really annoys me that this is the state of it, because I think if you're really that concerned about it, there are other things you can do. But who am I? Well, this one really made me nervous when I discovered that this was possible. So with GCP, anyone who has access to the project, there's an ability that you can actually SSH into any instance that is hosted in that project via SSH from the web console, whether or not you've been given that access. You just need to have access to the project, so you can access via SSH all the instances in the project as long as they have a public IP. If they don't have a public IP, this isn't possible. But with a public IP, you've got it. You can get access to it. This obviously presents a lot of security concerns, especially if you have some more sensitive processes going on these instances and you don't necessarily want everyone to have access to it. So in order to disable it, yeah, the whole state in the project, everybody just gets an SSH key. But in order to disable it, you need to install a magic config file in etc default and tell the account's daemon not to run, and then rerun the Google instance setup. This is something that you could add to the startup scripts when you're spinning up instances, and it should work. I'm not sure if Terraform has a support for that. We are doing it using Ansible, I believe. But it's frustrating to me that this isn't an option in the UI, because when you are spinning up instances in the UI, it does give you the option to block project-wide SSH keys, which you would think that maybe that would disable this specific feature, but it doesn't. If you've got a public IP associated with it and you've not done this, anyone can get in, well, that has access to the project. All right, so the final cautionary thing that I'm going to discuss with GCP has to deal with the metadata service. Now, this isn't unique to GCP. All cloud platforms have metadata services, and they are necessary, so that way you can get information about the specific instance that you're on. But the problem with GCP, or maybe just something to watch out for, is that you can also access the startup script that's associated with that instance through the metadata service. This isn't necessarily a big deal, but sometimes people like to hard code credentials into startup scripts so that way they're configured correctly. And if you aren't doing your due diligence to ensure that that isn't happening, then if there is some kind of compromise, they're going to get access to those credentials as well. So that's just something that you want to be aware of when you are managing GCP infrastructure is, well, just don't be hard coding credentials, period, but definitely not in the startup scripts. All right, so talked about GCP, talked about Azure. In comparison, AWS is going to seem a little bit of a golden child, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily perfect. They've been in the game so much longer than the other two, so they've dealt with a lot of these frustrations and fixed a lot of these issues that GCP and Azure are dealing with. But AWS still has its problems. You wanted to say something?
Oh yeah, I did. Did you decide to go with Golden Child just because of like their general color scheme, or was it because they actually are?
Maybe both.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, systems like people, we all have issues. First up, this isn't new. I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with this, but since I'm bitching about various security configurations that are present in cloud platforms, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. So the AWS metadata service, again, just like GCP, great to use to get information about the specific instance. You can also get information about the role that has been assigned to an instance. Problem here is that means that you also get access to the access keys, the secret key, and any tokens. So any other instances that have been assigned with these roles and profiles and any permissions that have been given to the role, if there is some kind of compromise, the attacker is going to get access to all of that. So they're going to be able to do a hell of a lot more than just evil things to that single instance. They're going to be able to affect your account in ways that wouldn't normally be possible if an instance role wasn't assigned to that specific resource. Now, I'm not saying don't assign roles to instances. That's not a good idea. You just need to ensure that the roles have the principle of least privilege, that you're not assigning incredibly permissive roles to these instances. Another way to get around, to secure this service is you can either block it entirely. Problem with that is there's a lot of legitimate use cases for the metadata service. The AWS CLI uses it, that's installed on the instances. And the Datadog agent uses this. So there's not necessarily, that's not the best fix. So what you could do, if you do need to use a service, is lock it down using IP tables and just stating what users are allowed to access it. And if it just happens to be root, if you're root on the machine, you already can do a lot of evil things, so why not just give it to root? But you can specify whatever owner that you needed there. My next frustration with AWS is the fact that you can't use multiple MFA devices. So just this past week, I was so excited because they announced support for YubiKeys. You can use U2F tokens, which is fucking badass. And so I, very quickly reconfigured my MFA to use a YubiKey because that's what I use everywhere else, and I love it, and why not? Problem is, the YubiKey only works for the console. It doesn't work for the CLI. So if you're trying to interact with it programmatically, you're kind of fucked. So the workaround here would be if they would just implement multiple MFA devices, I could use my YubiKey. But that's not a thing, unfortunately. And there's also a lot of other use cases for using multiple MFA devices. It's nice to have a backup because shit happens. You lose MFA devices, they break, or, God forbid, they get stolen. It would be nice to be able to transition to the backup seamlessly without having to endure a break glass scenario. Also, this is something that's being done by Google and GitHub, and multiple MFA devices is not a bad thing. So this is probably my biggest frustration with AWS, is the way that the security groups are handled. So since security groups are included in the EC2 service offering when you're dealing with it in the console, it does give the impression that security groups can only be applied to EC2 instances. That's not the case. There's a lot of other services that can make use of security groups, but it's difficult to tell the resource attribution for a specific security group because when you interact with it through the API, all it's going to tell you is what the security group, what rules have been configured, and the VPC ID, but that doesn't let you know whether or not it's actually in use by a service, or rather a resource within your account. Same thing with the console, doesn't really tell you anything. So getting attribution, finding attribution is kind of a headache. So as I stated before, security groups can be applied to EC2 instances, load balancers, Redshift, Lambdas, and there's a lot of tools available that will help you find attribution, but I have yet to find one that is complete and not prone to false positives, at least in the way we use security groups at Datadog. So one of the ways that you can do it is you could take the security group ID and paste it into the console, the interface, for whatever service offering you're trying to figure out whether or not it's in use for. So like in the EC2 listing, you can paste it, or network interface, you can paste it, and it'll come up with the resources. That's obviously not ideal, especially if you've got a massive list that you're trying to get through. The foolproof way to tell whether or not there's been a resource attributed to it, and we're talking non-programmatic, is to try to delete it. It seems counterintuitive, but that is a way to tell whether or not a security group has been in use, because then the UI will throw up a notice to let you know that it can't be deleted because it is actually in use. And then you can click on the link to find out where the resource is. So that really sucks. When you're auditing a report, or rather when you're auditing an account, you want to be able to tell what's being unused, what's being used, so you can tell what the actual attack surface is. So what I did is I created a tiny utility that's going to be open sourced here in the next week or two. And what this does is it takes the security group listing for an account in a specific region. It supports all regions, but we're just talking about the basics here. So it takes the security group listing for a specific region, and then it looks at all of these resources here and identifies the security groups that have been attached to them and just takes the diff. So the tool itself is going to help you with attribution. When you send it a security group ID, it's going to tell you what resource that's used for, or if it's a default rule, because you can't delete default rules in AWS. And then if you want to know what the unused security groups are, you can ask for that, and it'll give you that as well. This is showing the attribution for a default rule here. I don't know if you can read that in the back. And then the massive amount of text that's going to go by in about 2 seconds is showing the unused groups in that specific account until it needs a little bit of cleanup.
So at this point, I'm going to jump in here for a couple seconds and talk about the general, like, open to the world security group issues. By this, it's generally something that if you need to have something that's available to the world, then you should do it, like a web server or anything like that. But otherwise, making it this easy to just kind of like click in and go custom, or not even custom, but just say everything just to make things work, it's a little bit too easy to do while you're creating security groups. So there's nothing that other than this warning here that's, you know, the same color and everything as everything else in AWS's scheme to tell you that you shouldn't do this or that this is a problem. And if it's so easy to do it, you usually just skip it and say, no, this is going to make it work, and that's okay. Here.
The fact that they are doing that is a good thing.
Yeah.
That they are trying to clarify what all those zeros mean for developers who maybe I don't know, maybe they're not as great at networking and don't really realize the ramifications behind the setting that they're doing. So
kind of what we set up here at this point was a chain here. This is kind of how all of our events went through. And we get a CloudTrail, triggering CloudWatch rules, and then it would go to an SQS and then, I mean, at first it didn't do this, but once they actually enabled the ability to trigger Lambdas from SQS, it did this. But then it would just trigger a Lambda here to actually process the events that are going on. And by creatively naming the classes that are being involved here, we were able to create a bunch of different rules for all of the different event types that we cared about. So it isn't something that just is going to tackle security groups here. It's something that will deal with other things as well. So this is the tooling that we called our automated enforcement. And what this ends up doing now is blocks ingress to anything over than a /32, or if it's got a security group that's to another security group. It doesn't care about either of those two things.
do you want to tell them why we did a /32 and not a /0?
Well, yes, the initial version of it kind of checked to see if there were /0s and then just deleted those. But one of the sales engineers got really cute one day in the demo environment and put in 2 /1s and did the math on it, and that's the same, it turns out.
Found and determined. So
Yeah, exactly. At this point, they definitely wanted to make sure that this was a thing and show that it was happening. So to show kind of how this works out here. You'll have these things that'll be here. These are ones that were just created. And then after you give it a minute to actually go through that whole alert chain and you can refresh, it'll show up that they've actually been deleted. Whenever I was developing this in one of our environments, it was kind of fun and a little trolly because I hadn't set up some of the messaging yet. But one of the developers was trying to create one of these rules that was open to the world. And it just picked it up and deleted it. And then 10 seconds later, they tried to do it again. And then they did this about 10 times before they finally jumped into our security channel to actually jump in and say, hey, is something going on here? Are you guys doing anything strange? In which case we're like, hey, this is the policy that you agreed to follow, and we're going to help you do this thing. Now it actually sends messages to people on Slack and helps make that a little bit more aware. At this point, it's really reduced a lot of that down so that anytime that this does happen, it's really quick and people understand it, and it reduces the total number of people trying to do this really rapidly. Yeah. You want to take back over?
So that's our automated enforcement that helps with security group shenanigans. But in addition to that, we've thrown together a tool that's going to be open sourced that will enable better transparency when it comes to dealing with these cloud platforms. So each of these cloud platforms is really awesome in the sense that they've got a lot of APIs that you can use to interact programmatically with all the services that they have. But unfortunately, at least from an offensive perspective, when you're trying to get everything together for an engagement, when you're doing a network infrastructure security testing, you need an IP listing to start with, right? And there is no single API that you can hit that would give you all the endpoints for a specific account. You actually would need to script it up and everything because, yeah, it's a headache. Azure does have a public IP addresses API, which is awesome. So they recognize that this is an issue and this could potentially be very useful, but it's not comprehensive. It actually misses a lot of the database services, and I think some of the storage services are not included. So if your testing should cover that, then it's missing if you're only relying on that single API. They also don't have the inverse private IP addresses API. So if you are just doing an internal test, you're SOL on that as well. This can also be problematic in trying to get that transparency into AWS. And this is the same in other cloud platforms as well, but the better example is in AWS. So AWS has some service offerings that actually bundle other service offerings that are available in AWS. One specifically is Lightsail. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Lightsail is a very easy interface to use to spin up resources and have applications already configured on them. And it's just, you do a few configuration settings, a few options that you choose, and then it takes care of all the rest. And it's, of course, open to the world and everything. And essentially, it's just spinning up EC2 items with this data. But the problem is that any of the resources that are listed in the Lightsail service, like any of the resources that is spun up, those don't get repeated into EC2. So even though it's EC2 resources that it's actually spinning up, you don't see those in the EC2 listing. So if you're only relying on the EC2 listing to do your testing and your company actually does rely on Lightsail to spin up infrastructure, you've got a massive gap. Like that's a problem. So in trying to correct this and make sure that we have all of our bases covered and we are doing thorough testing for accounts because we live in the cloud, I threw together some Python modules to help this. These Python modules cover AWS, GCP, as well as Azure, and it enables you to get those external addresses and internal addresses for a specific account or multiple accounts in all the regions. And so it's very simple. I'm just showing the usage case here. It's the IP addresses function that we wanted all the IPs for the Platypus account. And it'll look at all of those different services that are commented out for that. Now let's say that you don't want the IP addresses for S3 because you're not really going to be performing an in-map scan against S3. You can configure it and target specific APIs with it, and it makes it very seamless. It's very, very easy to use. So what it returns back is really a Python dict of all that information for the account with the external IP addresses as well as the internal. And it's a massive time saver. But depending on, if you've got a lot of accounts, it can take a little bit longer to run.
Some of the interesting fun stuff on these is all these individual commands that are in here. Unfortunately, most of them are not like individual API calls. There are a bunch of them that have been kind of stapled together if you go through the whole modules themselves, most of which she found over iteratively and was very angry every single time, and I'm sad about it.
so there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that I put into building these modules. Yeah, one of them, so GCP was actually fairly easy, but Azure, as you can expect, was one of my more hated experiences, specifically because initially when I set out to do this, I was using the Azure SDK that they give for Python, which is, I would think that that would be the best way to go about it. But turns out that, unbeknownst to me, they had updated it, which is fine, but then that broke a couple of the APIs. And so when I updated the SDK, the actual change wasn't in the SDK. I guess they hadn't gotten around to it. And so my class, the modules just didn't work when I was trying to get those specific services and specific APIs. So I had to rewrite the whole thing for requests. I said, fuck this shit. I don't want to deal with trying to fix something that's in an SDK and then hope that it gets, implemented in production. I'm just going to handle it myself. But the classes do handle both classic as well as ARM. So you're only using one single function to get that data for all of it. It takes care of all of that pain. And so hopefully that'll make life just a little bit easier in dealing with it. So I have wish lists. The wish lists are in the hope that maybe someone who works with this platform, with these platforms, and is in a position where they could actually change. Maybe you can hear my cry for help and do something about this. But my main wish list for Azure is to either improve the ACLs for Classic or get rid of it completely. My theory is the reason why it's so painful to figure out how the hell to deal with Classic APIs programmatically is because Azure is trying to deprecate it. They've already deprecated the web portal, but there is, at least when I looked in this past week, I didn't find any information about them actively trying to deprecate Classic. But I mean, the documentation is not there on the site. It's like a stepchild that they're just trying to forget about. So my theory is that they are trying to deprecate it and just make it more difficult for people to deal with it, so people aren't going to want to be on it. Problem is, you can still spin up resources in Classic, so it's not a real fix in that respect. For GCP, I would love stronger ACLs for the SSH shenanigans. I know that that's a nice feature for devs, and so it's an unrealistic ask for them to completely get rid of it, but if we could just put fine-grained access controls through the interface and when you're interacting with it, so you don't have to go through the hoops and the shenanigans that I referenced earlier to actually disable it, that would be awesome. And then public IPs, disabling it, making it a little bit easier, not burying those settings.
Hold on. With GCP there, alternatively to not blocking port 25, could they also just block the other two ports? Would that work for you?
If we want to get rid of SMTP altogether, sure. But that's not a fucking fix. I told you, I'm a little salty. Sorry. All right, so on to the wish list for AWS. Disabling the metadata service completely is not a realistic ask, so I'm not even going to ask for that because, yeah, there are legitimate use cases, and I know that. We're just going to have to deal with it on our own and ensure that we're taking the proper steps to secure instances. But I think allowing multiple MFA devices would be reasonable. When I was looking for it, I know that this has been asked for since 2013, so 5 years to consider this request. Hopefully we can get some movement on it. And security groups, really, let's just make them their own service offering. So that way there won't be that misunderstanding that they're only applied to EC2 resources, that they can be applied elsewhere. That would be really awesome, and including the resource association with it. That would make me very happy. But thank you very much for listening to my rant session. Hopefully it wasn't too painful. Yeah.
What do you have right back there?
So he's asking about basically the way that they tier everything within would be based on subscription IDs, regions, that sort of thing. How do you work through that to make sure that that works with everything and that you actually get all of the information? Is that close enough?
Yeah, you're talking about specifically in the class or just in general? in general. So with Azure, yeah, you got to get the listings and go through it. Unfortunately, when you're looking at it, there's no real way to tell everything that belongs to you in the sense that like what subscriptions and that sort of thing, especially if you've got multiple tenants. So you just need to have a lot of communication with your dev teams in that respect. But when it comes to iterating through, you got to hit the right APIs to list it, and that way you're ensuring that you are doing the right iteration over all of them.
All right, we had one down here. So the question is, who is the therapy session
Me.
for? No, it's for me and all the abuse from the constant finding these things.
Yeah,
We got it right here.
To bitch about it.
Did we look at the GCP service perimeters?
What do you mean by service perimeters? Oh, to ensure that you're not open. So we use Terraform to manage a lot of it, and so we've got a lot of basic configuration set up so that way developers aren't setting it up with public IPs. We don't allow users, or rather devs, to configure and spin up instances using the UI. So that's the way that we get around it. And we've built out the specific VPCs to ensure that they're not publicly available.
All right, hold on. We got one here in the back.
No, granted, me bringing that up, it does make it an extremely targeted attack, an extremely limited attack. But the fact of the matter is that it's still there, and that's something that people, if they aren't aware of it, that they forget about, or they aren't as concerned when it comes to like SSRF and that sort of thing. But yes, the AWS does have various implementations in it to ensure that you aren't wide open if there is a compromise. They have done things to reduce that attack surface. That's a good point.
The big counter to that at all is even with that hour limit there, so much of the stuff that actually interacts with AWS is automated to just abuse that stuff the second that it can find it, that hour's not as helpful as you would hope. Right over here.
Yeah, just like ENIs, it does give you a lot, but it doesn't, like, because Redshift and everything, like, those aren't included. And so you are going to have some of the API calls, there is some repetition, but when I did a comparison over all the different services, I was still missing things if I would just try to hit one single service or, multiple. So that's why it covers as many as it does. Yes.
Hold on, let's get this guy first.
Sorry. So the tool is going to, if you follow me on Twitter, I will tweet about it. It's currently under review with the Datadog community team, which is why I haven't had it up, but it will be published open sourced under the Datadog name. And I will tweet about it once it is at that spot. Yeah, so follow me if you are interested in it. Yeah, see, that's what makes me nervous. I would really love it if AWS would publish documentation on their resources to let us know, like, all right, so these resources, these services here are what can have endpoints. These services here are what can be applied, security groups can be applied to, just for clarification and help us in trying to navigate all of this. Because in digging through this and trying to figure out what security groups can be applied to what resources, this was a lot of me just interfacing with all the different services and just playing around with it to figure it out, because there isn't, or at least I haven't been able to find any one source that mentions that. So yeah, there very well could be things that are missed in that respect. I haven't found any at Datadog, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't, because we just may not be using those services. So
right over here.
So we at Datadog do not use the IP tables solution because we just lock down the roles themselves to. Oh, yes, it does work.
Right back over here. So you can use a third-party provider to do that, but it's something that really should be included in the actual solution itself, in my opinion. Especially since we kind of have this whole thing coming from Google where they've got the two-factor going into their email, and they're already demanding that you have 2 tokens, and they don't even want you to sign up with only one of them. Yeah, right back there.
I like that.
Oh, it's entirely more likely that you've just upset her and she's going to have to go find this thing and do more work on it. So, yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah, that'll be in the next rant session. We were limited on time as to what I could actually include, so.
All right, thanks. Yes, I can. Okay, I'll do it afterwards. So my coworkers from a previous role found out that I am published inside of a Santa's book from years past where I wrote a letter to Santa, and it made it in there.
That's awesome.
So I've been a published author for quite some time.
How old were you?
I believe 6.
It's pretty legit. Did he get what you wanted?
I mean, no. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Anybody else?
We're good.
Awesome. Thank you for coming, everybody. Appreciate it.